Yeah, an institution for me is essentially a specific form of a social relation. Mm-hmm. And there are different, of course, different forms of social relations between, parents and children, for example, constituting the family as a social institution. And some kinds of those social relations, they become, cultural relations, and densified in some the more complex societies become the more, cultural the social relations get, and then, some kind of houses are built for representing those social formations, and that is what the institution as we know them, as the museum or the parliament or the palais de justice or whatever, are made up. And I think the main feature in thinking of institutions is in that way is that we can understand them as not something which is, defined as an inside, social space, and this something which is completely outside, but that it's always an inside-outside relationship. Yeah? There's no such thing as an outside of an institutional space. Institutional space is social space. The term institutional critique can easily be misunderstood as a critique which is purely against institutions and would presume a space outside of institution. But as I've said before, in terms of institution, there is no space outside of institution. So institutional critique can only be understood as a certain form of, criticizing some cultural, manifestations of those institutional dynamics, how they get, petrified or ideologized within certain situations. But institutional critique has to be aware of, its own instituting character, that it's always in the name of another institution or another discourse, and that it has in itself a very strong idea of a new canon, for example. So it's all, from being outside, and being in a purely, let's say, moral and authentic space of a position of speaking, but it is highly involved, and institutional critique is interesting for me if it is addressing precisely those moments from inside and outside. And I think you can very easily distinguish, different generations of institutional critique precisely in terms of that understanding of the institution itself. No, for me it's not a paradox. For me, I'm a big supporter of the idea of the author. Yeah, it's one of my, big also theoretical claims that the death of the author is, more or less was a very good marketing gag, to say it brutally. It made Roland Barthes a famous author, and Roland Barthes was, very smart and was reflecting that. And if he only would have lived a little bit longer, I'm sure he would, because in the end of his life he went strongly in a new debate about subjectivities, and also about what that means or can mean for authorship. So for me, for several, the ideas of authorship were, for me, in a very interesting way, came up in the late 50s, early 60s, in several, La Politique des Auteurs from André Bassin, for example, the implied author from Wayne Sibou's literary critic, but also Duchamp's consideration of his own authorship, which are all, attempts not to give up the category of the author. Yeah? And I think we should not renounce that idea. Yeah? It's important to become authors. Yeah? And the question of collectivity is another one. Yeah? And we also need ideas of collective authorship in a certain way. That would be interesting for me. Not collectivity as an answer and a solution for the problem of the author, but quite the opposite, yeah, that collectivity needs an idea of authorship in itself. Yeah? What would that mean, a collective authorship? Yeah? And I think this could be a very interesting discussion. I did a project in 2007 where we tried, where I had this, the Secession in Vienna offered me to do an exhibition, and I had this, you know, from the 90s and before, a long experience working collectively, and so I thought I was not interested to do it again in a collective because it's so difficult to have decision processes, making, etc. But I decided, you know, I invite other people taking responsible for, you know, parts of the exhibition. You know? And that was very interesting and very, for me, very surprising, and I think for all of them, what I've heard, a very interesting model of interference, yeah, and exchange. And it was not really a collective project. That would have been something different, because there was clear that I was the, you know, curator of the whole show, but I also had not the control of all, you know, ends, yeah, and there were the tweens and special, you know, situations in the exhibitions which were not done by myself. Yeah? And I liked that kind of model, yeah, and it made it possible that everyone could have, you know, develop his or her own idea of authorship within that, and we created within my framework, we created also some kind of communality, yeah, of authorship, yeah, and that was, authorship itself was the topic of the show, yeah. And those are interesting. This is also, of course, not the answer to your question, yeah? But it is just one attempt to how we can define that, and that we have to explore that space, yeah? What it means, you know, in terms of authorship. Yeah? And because I think it's really crucial to keep up that position. For me, it's more interesting and more promising than to discuss authorship than, for example, the term artist. Yeah? But historically, it would also be interesting to examine what is the difference, actually. Is an author someone who writes, and an artist someone who makes an artwork? But we speak about authors in film theory, for example, very clearly it's all about authorship there. So can this concept be transformed? But what does it mean then? Yeah? Then it's not related to poetry, to the act of writing itself. So it gets a metaphor for something else. And this metaphorical potential for me is very interesting. So what does it mean to call an artist an author? Yeah? Under which conditions? But also a curator can be an author. Or a critic in many ways. So it's a category which allows maybe different relationships to design and to envision between, yeah, for example, artists, curators, and critics, which are not based on this classical concept that here's the productive subject and here's the reflective subject, yeah, and the curator is more or less custodian, taking care of what the productive people do, but the exchange can be addressed in a less hierarchical way, but also not in a purely, you know, intertextual way. Yeah, that was the '60s model. You know, that it's all the same. Yeah, there's no difference anymore. Of course, there's a difference, but we have to find out what the difference is, and I think the category of authorship is a good one to precisely try to find that out. Yes, yeah, for sure it is changing, but the interesting aspect for me is that it is not defined clearly. Yeah, it is an ambition. You have to do something, to become an author. Yeah, and so in the literary world that is quite established, and it's not sure if you're an author when you write one book. Yeah, when you have 3 books, you might be an author. Yeah, so where is the boundary? Yeah. What does your writing make you, and at what point does the writing make you an author? Yeah? So it has to do with certain features, certain elements, yeah, arguments, formal structures which relate to each other to create that, you know, fiction. Yeah, of course it's fiction. Yeah, that's not. Yeah, but it's an important fiction. Yeah, and I think we were too eager in this you know, in the course of post-structuralist critique of authorship. Yeah, which is, you know, I mean, birth of a reader. I mean, is this a solution? Yeah, the birth of a reader? No, definitely not. Yeah, and it's authorship is for me a clearly indispensable category, and that is why we have to reconstruct in a certain way the post-structuralist arguments, yeah, in order to be able to understand, yeah, those categories like authorship or also the work. Yeah, for me the work functions in a very similar way as the category of